Jai Baba. I'm so happy to be here. All the times I've come to this building and looked at the stage, I never thought I'd be up here. But it's a beautiful feeling. Would you please join me just for a small prayer? Beloved God, help us all to love you more and more, and more and more, and still yet more, till we become worthy of union with you. And help us all to hold fast to Baba's Zaman to the very end. Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai. Thank you. Well, my father was Frank Eaton. He was the first caretaker here at the center. He was born in Schenectady, New York, on Valentine's Day, 1911. And there's so many questions I wish I would have asked him, and I never did. But he grew up sort of a middle-class upbringing. His father worked for General Electric, and they had a nice little home not too far from the center of town, over near Vale Cemetery. Some of you know where that is. Has been Schenectady and are from there. He took violin lessons growing up, and he took them for 10 years, and he told me children used to pick on him for he would be heading to get his lessons, and they're like, Frankie, man, or whatever they did back then in the teens and 20s. But he went anyway, and he was a very good violinist. He learned to read music, and he could play. It was amazing. He could play string quartets. It was beautiful, a wonderful thing. My father's life was really music and Baba. But he had the misfortune of graduating the year the stock market crashed. So there was not too much going on back in those days, and no jobs, no work. Money was scarce. The families grouped together and kind of made it, stuck together, and everyone contributed what little or whatever they had. But he said that they would sit around the table and just play cards all day. There wasn't much to do, but now and then there would be something to do. So there he finally joined the Army in 1934, was stationed in Hawaii, and along in that time he picked up the saxophone because he loved jazz music. That was the thing back then. So he played the saxophone, and he marched in the regimental band for Franklin Roosevelt. I have a wonderful large picture of them. There was hundreds of guys there, and then some other ones, a small picture where you actually see Roosevelt on the stand in his white Panama suit as they're going by, and I guess Frank's first wife, Kay, put a little arrow down that says, "My honey." It was a little tiny, is that Dad? So he came back home from the Army. He got out early because his younger brother got ill. And I guess you could get out back then. Of course, that's when we had hardly any army. I think Yugoslavia had a bigger army than the United States during that time. But he went to Kansas. He got married to his first wife, Kay, and they traveled around looking for work. He went to Kansas and played with a territory band there. And he used to play at Saranac Lake. I have a nice photograph of him in his band uniform, a little jacket, a big brass button, and he's playing his clarinet in the backyard of his mother's home. And so I grew up around all this beautiful music, jazz and classical music, which was totally, totally out of context with growing up in the Bible Belt of South Carolina in this area. But I loved that music. I still love that music. And somehow, I'm not quite sure, this is pretty much conjecture, but I think it's true, he did take a job as a chauffeur for the mayor of Schenectady. So Darwin worked for the city of Schenectady, Darwin Shaw. and somehow they met. I have this little video that plays in my mind that Dad was sitting there waiting for the mayor of Schenectady to come out, and he's reading some spiritual book, and Darwin comes along and he notices the title and he's like, "Oh, well, you're interested in that? Oh yeah." And Darwin says, "Well, you must go. There's a group of us that meet down in New York City, and we're interested in this spiritual master from India, Mayor Baba." So Dad went, "Oh, okay." So he started going there. In the early days with Norina and Elizabeth and all the really, really old early followers, and evidently it was his cup of tea. Never saw my father as a searcher, but he was a very quiet man. Once again, I wish I'd asked him more. But first thing you know, there's talk of building a center in Myrtle Beach. So he gets on board with that, and he comes down with his wife. She stays for a little while and realizes that's not her cup of tea. And it was really interesting when Charles gave his presentation about the early days with Norina and showing all those wonderful pictures here and all the correspondence and so forth. And I saw her name on there, K. Eaton. I thought, this is cool. So that's my dad's first wife. Yep, there she was here. But she went back home. So Dad stayed. And believe me, this was a wilderness back then. There was nothing here. I think he stayed at Yopon Dunes and came here until there was somewhere to stay. They got the 4 cabins from the Air Force Base. I think it was the near and far, the caretaker's cabin, and the lagoon cabin. So Dad needed a place to stay. So, and during World War II, and you couldn't get materials easily, so he must have seen or heard or read in a magazine or whatever that you could get a chicken coop kit, because they encourage you to grow your vegetables and your meat, because everything was rationed. So Dad got the bright idea, I could live in that. So he ordered it, and I'm sure it came by rail to Myrtle Beach to Chapin Company, and then brought it here and erected it right out there. And he had such great delight in showing me, see that little square thing? That's where the chickens would come in and out. It was just to authenticate that that was a chicken coop at some time. But they had no refrigeration, no electricity. It was basically camping out here and then taking orders from Elizabeth and Norina and whatever Baba said to do this, that, and the other. And they kept some of their perishables in the lake. He said whenever it would rain really hard, he would sit in the coop and look out, and you could see the snakes coming up from the lower ground and trying to find a dry spot. So I can't imagine that. And then one time I thought, yeah, you sleeping in this coop? I was sleeping in the coop. I wanted to stay in there. I was laying there looking at it. He was a prisoner. He was a prisoner of love. This is like something a torture thing. If you were like on a county prison farm or something like that. But my father, he was the most mellow and uncomplaining person. He may have not always been that way. I'm sure being with Baba, following Baba's orders, trying to emulate that life of calming your mind, got him that way. There weren't many things that could rattle him. And then in 1947, early 1948, he was in town going to a restaurant there. The building is still there. It's near that big zip line right in the heart of Myrtle Beach. And my mother was waitressing there. My mother grew up on a farm out near Loris. There were 10 children in their family. And the women worked just like the men. She could plow behind a mule. She said, I could work the other end of a crosscut saw. There was nothing, she said, I worked like a man. And she said, one thing chafed me about that is that I could do a man's work, but the religious dogma of the Christian religion said we were not on equal. So she said it made me so angry that we had to leave church, rush home, and start cooking dinner, and the men were just dragging out in there and talking in the front yard of the church. And when they came in the house, they expected that dinner to be ready. And they had to eat in the kitchen, and the men were fed from the dining table, and they got first picks on the food, and then whatever, they took that back in the kitchen, and the women could eat. So that really bothered my mother. She was an early feminist, I assure you that. And by having to fight so hard with 10 children, they had very little money. She said they didn't know there was a depression because they did everything for themselves. They bought sugar and flour and a few things like that. Other than that, they raised their own meat and they grew their own vegetables and made their own cloth. Her grandmother was a midwife and an herbal doctor. And she delivered a lot of children, black and white children. Mom worked with a lady when she worked to work at the Gullyville restaurant, an older lady named Eunice, and Mom says, where are you from? She says, I'm from over somewhere. He says, oh, really? And she said, well, I'm from Bayberry, you know, and my mother was a Granger, and my great-grandmother was Helon Granger. She said, Helon Granger? Yeah, she did. She delivered me. And Mom said, oh, that's, yeah, it was just connections like that. So Mom said, I married the first man who would ask me to get away from that farm. I was so tired of that. So that didn't work out. So she ended up in Myrtle Beach during the war, working in a restaurant, and after the war. And Dad came in, and I guess he was interested in her. So I want to get this right now. So he asked her to go out on a date. And believe it or not, back then there were no restaurants in Myrtle Beach open during the night. So if they went on a date, they had to drive to Conway, and it wasn't on 501. You went to Sockasty and over the old drawbridge and the Conway that way. And they had a pleasant time, I suppose, and coming back on 544 back then, which was purely a rural road. Dad starts slowing down in the car and flips on his right turn signal, and Mom's thinking, oh no, the first date. He's going to get all octopus on me here. So no sooner had she said that than Dad says, now don't get worried. I'm just a little warm. I'm going to pull off the road, take my coat off and fold it and put it in the back seat. And Mom says, I knew then and there I was going to marry that man. So she just didn't know how she would snag him. So he came in, and I suppose they dated a few times. I don't know that for sure because Mom never told that part of the story. But she said one day Dad came in and was having his lunch in the booth, you know, and she'd waited on him. And she thought, my mother was wily. Oh, she was wily. She said, this guy, a new pulled up right in front of the restaurant and parked at the curb with a brand new Cadillac convertible. And he came in and she says, you know, I cut up with everybody. Says he came in and he's like, hi, Irene, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm just doing fine. It's really a mighty fine looking car. Yeah, I just bought that. He says, and he says, why don't you just turn that grill off and get out of those clothes and we'll hop in that car and go to Florida. We'll have us a big time. And Mom said, well, I can't just run off like that. So, but if you'll give me about an hour, I think we can go. So my dad's sitting there. And so he left, and he wasn't going to come back. It was just in fun, but Dad didn't know that. So she goes over there to fill his drink or check on him, and she turns and starts going. He says, wait a minute. He said, you can't go off with that guy. And Mom says, well, I want to know why I can't. He says, because I'm going to marry you. So she found out and she married him. They got married. So then a progression of children. My brother Frank in 1948, me in 1955, and John in 1962. In the meanwhile, having to live off a caretaker of the spiritual center's salary was not very easy. It was hard. But when they first got married, Baba cabled and said that Frank couldn't stay on the center anymore. And I'm sure he thought maybe he was going in another direction, so he took a job at the high school teaching band and driver's education. That was in 1948, yeah, right after they got married. So he did that for a few years, and I'm sure he kept his affiliation with the center. It was just different now that he was married and Frank came along. So that lasted 4 years, 52. Then he decided he would move back to Schenectady. So he packed up the kids and packed up everybody and moved up. And they were staying with his mother. And his mother was a very formidable woman also. So having two formidable women in the same house was not a good thing. But it was good because Dad took a job at General Electric and he made good money and they had a new car and everything was nice. I can look at photographs and movies and slides back then. Everyone was dressed nicely and so forth. But alas, not to be. Grandma Eaton was too much divisiveness going on there. So Mom said, I want to go back home. So they came back home and Dad started an orchestra, a big band. And they played all over around locally. They played in Charleston at the Naval Base. They played at this old shrine club there. That was Jane Haynes' place and where Baba went. I can remember when I was very small seeing a big car pull up in the yard. This was later after the band disbanded, and 5 or 6 guys would go and play a band job. Anyway, Dad was rolling along with that, and he had plenty of work. And Baba cabled and said he wanted him to come back and caretake at the center. So he disbanded the band. I heard it was really good. They played at the Ocean Forest Hotel. I have a nice large photograph of the band, one of my prized possessions. And I still have the saxophone he played in that band. But he came back, had the band a little while, and then he returned caretaking here. And then he went, one of the fortunate ones that went on 3 incredible weeks. The Westerners that got to spend the 3 weeks with Baba in September of 1954. And he came back from that and continued on to the center, and then I was born. But things were really, really, really hard. I mean, I think I found some correspondence and it said that Dad made $1.25 an hour and then a little bit extra for staying overnight. He worked all day, and then he was also the night watchman. So he would put in a day's work, come home, be with us for dinner and bedtimes, and then he'd get up at 10:30 or 11 and drive in here and spend the night and get up at 6 and come back. So it was an awful, awful lot of time. Meanwhile, the family grew and it grew, and the money was harder and harder to make go the distance. But they were really wonderful times. I got to spend a lot of time here with my dad, following him around. I adored him. He was such a sweet and nice and gentle and loving man. With hugs and kisses, and he didn't talk very much. He was just a good companion. So, and I loved when he'd bring me in to spend the night with him. That was so much fun. And one night he had told me he would take me in because I was probably badgering him and he just wanted to get me off his case. So I fell asleep, and I remember waking up and hearing the car start out in the yard, and I knew it was him. And I heard the car backing away. And at this time we lived in Windy Hill in an upstairs apartment. So I charge out of the house screaming, "Daddy, don't leave me, Daddy, Daddy, help, don't leave me." And he can't hear me, he's driving away. He was driving that little Nash that Sharosh followed Baba out west where the accident happened. A little tan Nash station wagon. And I can remember seeing the little taillights going away and hearing the motor, and I'm, "Daddy, Daddy." Next thing you know, Mom has me. You can't run at her. Get back in bed. So the next morning, there were all these people coming to the house from the neighborhood, and Mom told the story later. Says they all came. "Are you and Frank okay? I mean, what? Was he leaving you last night in the middle of the night?" Oh gosh, that was so much fun. So we had quite an interesting childhood. Once my brother, Frank, my older brother, thought it would be fun to throw a rock and have it land next to me and scare the daylights out of me. Why that would scare the daylights out of me, I have no idea. But I was coming towards the house, and he threw this rock, and he saw that it was going to strike me. So he's like, "George, look out." And what do? Bam, right, and knocks me cold. So he grabs me by the wrist, dragging me to the house, screaming, "Mom, I killed George, Mom." So Mom comes out, "Oh my goodness," she's tending to me, and Frank up, calls the center, calls the center, gets Dad on the phone, says, Daddy, I've killed George." And click. So Dad gets in the truck, tears out. He doesn't even stop for the gate. Comes home. By that time, I'm okay. And I can remember several days later coming through and looking at the gate like, what happened to that? All these splintered green timbers lying by the road and a chain. That's just all until they could rebuild it. So it was lots of fun. But it was wonderful too, because this was like our own private paradise. We would come to the ocean all the time on the weekend. It was so nice just to come here and no one here, go to the big wide beach and just have the run of it. It was like we were rich. We had an estate with God. And yeah, it was a lot of fun spending time here with him too. An awful lot of fun. Just following him around, raking, doing things like that. With him, I was probably more trouble than I was worth, but he never let me know that. He was always just so loving and so forth. But he loved to take a nap. And there was this old one-armed guy, George Anderson, that worked here. He could do anything with one arm, rake, and it was interesting to watch him light his cigarette. I remember watching him like, oh, that's pretty cool. So, but they would decide, and he said, well, Frank, I believe it's time for us to take a nap, don't you think? Frank, like, oh yeah, that would be nice. So they'd go down a fire break somewhere, and I'd be trapped in the middle, and these two guys, let me out here. It was, see, Baba exercise and patient. He starts young. So, one time, another thing I loved doing when I was young was every Christmas Margaret Krask would take the Southern Crescent train and come down to Florence. And Dad would go on Saturdays to pick her up. And that was a great adventure for me. And I loved being on Dad because I could just talk and yippity-yap and just, he was mine. So, and we'd take Baba's car, the green and turquoise and white 58 Ford, which I thought was very cool because it had a big engine in it, blah, 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 blah. We had a banana yellow, 4-door, 54 Studebaker. You can't get any more ugly than that. I was embarrassed of that car. But I got to ride in the Ford, and I'd ride in the back seat, and I'd ride in the front seat. And we'd go there to Florence, and then we'd always be there a little early. So we'd go have lunch, and that was special because we never got to eat in a restaurant or anything like that. I did that, get to do that. And I'd follow Dad, and we'd look at the timetables. I thought that was so cool. My dad knows, well, okay. So finally, it was all right, we got to get there. So we'd go out and stand on the platform and wait, anticipation. And then I'd say, I see the light, there's the light. And he'd say, yeah, they're coming. And you could hear it, whoop, whoop, blowing the horn. And then pretty soon as it got closer, the ground would shake. And that was so exciting, seeing this big locomotive coming into the station and clanging and all that. It was just great. I was standing there holding my dad's hand. And Margaret would come out, and they'd start talking and talking and talking. And we'd get in the car and start home, and I'd be in the back seat. And they were talking and talking, and how I wish I knew what they were talking about. But one time, Margaret, after barely acknowledging me the whole trip, said, how would you like a cookie? And we never had any kind of sweets or anything at home. And I'm like, yeah. So she rummages around, and it looks like it's beautiful, like oatmeal cookie, and I grab it, and I'm like, oh. No sugar, no salt, no, it was like, you'd imagine a dog biscuit. But being the polite little Southern boy, I'm trying my best. And she said, how do you like that? Well, it's good. So I couldn't let the window down and fling it out, because it was winter time. So I just suffered along with it and got it down. And see, like 60 years later, I remember that. But yeah, Margaret was very sweet, but that happened every year. And then on Baba's birthday, they would have parties at Dilruba. And I remember going there, and there weren't too many people, but Elizabeth, Kitty, and Ruth White, and because there was no one who lived here. We had no nearby community. We were the only community. Everyone else came for a visit. He would come, even when I'd come with him here. Like I said, it was like our own private place, other than Elizabeth and Kitty would come through. But the parties were really nice, and I remember once standing at that table looking, and they had a cake that was made like Baba's flag. It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw, and I'm like, I couldn't. Here comes my mom. You will leave that cake alone. Go sit down. So, and Dad would begin the beginning on his fiddle, and then they'd show movies with the old projector. I think it's the old 16 projector is back there still. And it wasn't much fun for me, but I remember that. It was just kind of a special time being there. One night we got a call. There's motorcycles on the center. And so I heard that. Dad says, I got to go into the center. There's motorcycles on the center. So I want to go. No. All right, finally he takes me. So here we come in the center. And my dad he was such a careful driver. A car would last him 100 years. He was so gentle on it. And my sister followed him back from Maryland one time. She says, I swear, the distance between each side and the white line was just perfect the whole way. 500 miles. It was like not more than an inch or two variation. But he was that way. He was a good driver. And we come in the main road, and we come riding along there, and it was dark, and really excited. And right as we approached the cross street that goes to the beach and around to the library, here goes this little like Honda's 50. Like, there he is, Dad. And he went, and then we're right on the guy's rear end. This guy is freaking out. He's hitting the middle of the berms of the road and like this, and we're right on his tail. Like, yeah, Dad, go get him, get him, Dad. And we got to where you turn left, bear left to go to the barn and the beach, and the road went straight. That's the old Kings Highway section. In fact, the whole road is, but that was blocked off with this log, and this guy hits this thing going wide open, and a little scooter was like, boom, and I thought he lost it, but no, he kept going. Dad jumps out, flings the log out of the way, and the chase is on again. So we catch up to him, and we're right on his tail again. I don't know what Dad thought he was going to do. Maybe he thought when the road ended that he would catch him, but the guy sees a fire break, and he decides to make a break for it. And when he cuts like that, of course, the bike slows down in that white sand, and Dad slams on the brakes. I almost hit the dash, and comes to a stop. The engine stalled out, and the guy gets away. So we're like, the car won't go. So I got out, and he tried digging around the wheels and digging this, and I was trying to help him, but the car was hopelessly stuck. So we walked all the way from there back to Dilruba and got an old Ford station wagon Elizabeth had. And we came back, and Dad's thinking, he must have went down Lake Arrowhead Road, and it was the only place he could have gone. So we go down Lake Arrowhead Road, and here's this guy walking down the side of the road. We didn't know it, but it was the motorcycle guy. And Dad rolls in, hey, bud, did you see a little motorcycle guy? And I was like, no. No, he wouldn't even look in the car. Oh, thanks, Dad. So we came around, and then we saw one way down there, way down the other end of Lake Arrowhead Road. So Dad, he floors it. And here we go, and I'm watching the speedometer, and he's like, wow. Oh, my God, 70, 80, 100. This isn't my dad. Yes, yes, yes. So, but we didn't catch him. He ran down in the woods, and Dad said, that's enough. So the next day, we found out that the guy that cut in front of us and bogged down the truck, he had run into the big ditch that runs through there and didn't see it, and bent up the motorcycle. And yeah, that was him that walked out. That was him. And the truck, Dad had slammed on the brakes so hard because it would have ran right over the guy and killed him, I'm sure. It actually bent the steering rods out like that, so it couldn't move. The Billy Smith, the local garage for years, came and had to tow it out and fix it. And then one morning when I'd spent the night with him, we were getting out of the caretaker's cabin. He always parked in front of the cabin on the hill. And we heard over towards, he said, there's somebody on Gator Lake. So we got in the truck, drove over to Gator Lake, stopped in the road, and there was not a nice place there like it is now. It was just a little path. And he stayed in the truck. He disappears, and they're going on and gone and gone, and I'm freezing. There was no heat in that old truck. And suddenly, here's Dad and this guy with a big shotgun, and they're both soaking wet. And he puts the ducks and the gun in the back and puts the guy in the passenger side. I'm scrunched over, and here Dad sits here, and he's like, I really hate to do this to you, fella, but it's my job. I have to turn you in. So we took the guy up to Watson's store. He was a magistrate, and he was arrested. But the story was, what happened was the guy freaked out when Dad said, hey, what you doing here? And he jumps in the pond in the Gator Lake with his waders on, and he can't get out. He's in there drowning, and help, help. So Dad went in there. It was cold, too, and pulled him out and saved his life. But then one day we walked out of the kitchen, and we heard somebody, holy God, look at the size of that thing there. Look at that fish. And Dad like, went down the steps, and there were two guys right down the hill in the lagoon cabin fishing. And the fish in that lake, the brim were like this. They were beautiful. And they were just smiling and walked up and said, "Well, fellas, I got to take you in. I hate to do it, but it's my job." So we packed them in the truck, me once again in the middle, and they're looking very forlorn with their tackle sticking out. And took them back to Watson, and I don't know whatever happened to them. I'm sure Reynolds Watson enjoyed the fish, may still have the poles, and probably kept the guns and ducks, because you could do that in the South. If you had any sort of law enforcement badge or ability, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted to the people. So it was fun, lots of fun. Am I leaving anything out, Carolyn?
Oh, Elizabeth. Elizabeth and your mom.
Oh, yes. Well, anyway, we lived in a home. It's still there. It's right next to Nakado's, and it's painted blue, kind of like this. And it was a gas station. When we lived in it, it had been turned into a home, but not a very large and commodious and spacious and luxurious home. Mom said when we first moved in, when the wind would blow, the linoleum would flutter on the floor. And when I was a baby, she had to put me in a drawer, put blankets and towels around me, and put bottles of hot water when it got really bad, because the heat was terrible in there. It had a fireplace, that was it. So here we were, Mom and Dad and 3 boys living in there, and there was 1 bedroom. We had 2 double beds, one like this, and a single over here. Mom and Dad, John and I, and Frankie, who was probably 13 at that time, in the single bed. And all our stuff was under the beds. There was no storage room. It was just really miserable. We didn't have a shower. We had a shower, didn't have a tub. The shower was on the back porch. It was a metal stall. And we'd outgrown the big sink in the kitchen to bathe in. So, and my dad, he was just, he was interested in the spiritual life. He'd never speak up, and he wouldn't say anything. Beautiful, sweet man, though. And that's how these 2 got together, because my mom was a pioneer woman, and she would speak up. And she had had enough. She couldn't get my dad to do it, so here she goes again. How can I get this done? I know, I'll invite Elizabeth over here for lunch. So that's what she did, and Elizabeth came over. And you got to remember, Elizabeth was a true American aristocrat. She didn't think about things like that. She was up here thinking about the senator and Baba and how she could serve him and take care of all of that. But so Elizabeth came over, and Mom says, "Elizabeth, I want you to see how we're living here." So she showed Elizabeth around, and Elizabeth says, "Irene, I had no idea, but I will do something about this." So it wasn't very long after that, the carpenter for the center at that time, Mr. Chris Platt, came, and I saw him out there with his old fold-out measuring thing, and they ended up putting a bathtub addition to the bathroom, and they put really nice room on the back. One end was all closets, and that's where Frank and I ended up in there. So the house got large enough that it was comfortable to live in. That was a big help, but it was still tough. We didn't have very much, but we did have fresh food. My mother grew a garden. We had a garden every summer and spring. We had wonderful corn. Ralph Hernandez used to come by just to get the corn. And that was the one thing he said in my father's memorial service we had here. He said, he had the best corn. So many touching things. And I feel blessed to have come up the way I did, because the poverty, the But then again, there was something to offset that, you know. There was all this wonderful music and books. My grandfather Eaton wanted us to, and loved reading, so, and I loved to read. There were all these Baba people that would come in and out from all walks of life. And each one of them was so special. I thought today about how Baba picks each one of you for a purpose. That's why there's so many talents in the Baba world. So many talents, because you all fit together like this beautiful tapestry of people to do his work. And we all do our part. And it's very important what each and every one of us do. And that got me way off now. So I suppose I'll tell you about my meeting with Baba. I was not quite 3. It was in 1958 when he was here, right over there at the side of the caretakers cabin during the children's party. I don't really remember meeting him, but I do remember the prasad I got. Fortunately, Dee Dee Eaton took a picture of it. And Baba's holding my face like this and kissing me on the cheek. And I'm like, so we walked away, Dad and I, he took my prasad away, and I'm like, And he says, no, I'm going to I can remember him saying, no, I'm going to let you have it, I just don't want you to choke on it. So he pulled out his pocket knife, and it was a lemon drop, and he broke it up in little pieces, and then he gave me a piece, and I was like, oh, and spit it out. He's like, oh, no, don't do that. I didn't want it. I didn't want it. And then, you know, what other 2.5-year-old would like a lemon drop? But that was the luck of the draw. So that was very nice. Very nice. But we grew up in poverty, but you know, Bob always pays. He always pays his dues. He always takes care of you. That's one thing that's come to the forefront the longer I live, and I have more history look back. I realize that it just fits perfectly. Everything fits so perfectly. But this lady moved into town, a Baba lover, named Bernice Jensen, but everyone called her Niecy. She was a vaudeville actress and lived in New York City all her life. And she didn't know how to drive, so she came here and bought Happy House down behind the First Baptist Church, or Ocean View Baptist Church, and moved in there. And she met my mother, and it was like sisters at first sight. And she loved my dad. She was always teasing my mom that she was going to take him away from her. But Niecy was loads of fun. She had funds, and she wanted someone to play with. So my mother was it. And my mother started out cleaning her house and things like that. But she admired my mother because my mother was very straightforward. She was very honest. She was the salt of the earth. It didn't matter if you were the lowest of the low, the highest of the high, you got treated the same. She would never take advantage of someone because of their status. But they went to Hawaii together, had a great time. Niecy would buy us stuff. I remember going to her husband had been an officer in World War II, and unfortunately he was killed in action, but she still had her benefits. She could go on bases and buy things. So we went to the PX one day, and I saw this guitar, and I'm like, I like that. You want that? I said, yeah, I do. She said, will you learn to play it? Oh, yeah. And she just bought it for me. But she was that way, so very generous, and she was such a character, being an actress and a performer and entertainer. She carried a ukulele with her most of the time, and she would just burst out in the song and start doing the Charleston and things like that. It was just so cool. All these people I got, yeah. But eventually, Mom taught her how to drive too. She didn't know how to drive, so Mom taught her how to drive. Eventually, she decided she would move to California to be with her daughter. And about that time, I had left home and moved up in North Carolina with this love interest that I had to really escape from the poverty. And but when I came back, Mom was flush with money. You know, you can hit Mom up for anything. Hey, Mom, I want to buy this little car. Sure. But she had started working on, finally I put it together. She's not making that kind of money working in the kitchen over there at that restaurant. But she never did, she kept her secret very well. Later on I found out that Nisi had given her $50,000 before she left. And that really, so Baba, it was such a gift from Baba. Such a gift. It made such a difference in our lives and made everything much more nice for us. But Mom didn't say anything about it. Mom was very frugal. She added to it. And Dad was, as usual, he did have a penchant for musical instruments, though. He would sneak off and buy one, and he kept it in the caretaker's cabin. Both sides of the caretaker's cabin was just loaded with stuff he didn't want Mom to know about. Once Joe Chestnut, who also was a caretaker here early on, had this really nice coat, and Dad admired the coat, and Joe said, well, I got it at Belk's or wherever. So Dad slips down there and buys him one, and he keeps it under the back seat cushion of the car, and he'll drive down the road and put it on. And then he comes back, stops it, and then he comes home. Well, unfortunately, someone who knew the whole family saw him with the coat on and said, Frank, that's a gorgeous coat. Oh, yeah, you like that? Yeah. Well, yeah, happened to mention in passing to my mother, Frank had this gorgeous coat on the other day. And so Mom's like, I know what he's done. So she confronts him about it, and of course he swears up and down, and she badgers him. Finally, he has to give in, relent, and show her where the code is. But there were many things like that. Once we were at my sister's during Christmas and had a big Christmas dinner and fires raging in the fireplace. She lives in an old home and farmhouse. It was built in 1883 or something like that. So it was really like a picturesque Christmas. And we all had dinner and Christmas Eve we went to bed. Well, next thing I know, somebody's shaking me. Get up, the house is on fire. The house is on fire. Huh? It was like 18 outside. I jump up in my undershorts and run, and my mom catches me at front. Yeah, you got time to put on your clothes. Don't go out there like that. In the meanwhile, while I'm standing there, I see Dad. He's got I recognize it, his accordion case. And he's going out the door, and he goes out, takes his keys out, patunk. There was nothing else in the trunk. He puts that right in the center of the trunk. Comes back into my house. My mother's standing here like this. She comes in and says, Frank, you mean to tell me you let every stitch of our clothing and your children's clothing burn up in this house, and the only thing you thought of to get out of the house is that damn accordion? And Dad's like, he says, well, you know, I could make a buck with it. She says, Frank, I've been married to you for 35 years. You never made a buck doing anything with any of those musical instruments, and you never will. So I just walked away, and he was standing there. He'd been caught. The little boy had been caught. Oh. Seems like I'm leaving out something else.
When you came to Baba?
Oh, yes. Well, you know, when you're growing up, you want to fit in. Well, this was not a good place.
How about your dad's passing?
Huh?
Your dad's passing.
Oh, that? Okay, yeah. With the,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Well, 1989, we found out Dad had cancer, and he didn't want to do anything about it. He just said, well, how long do I have? And he said, well, probably a long time. And he didn't want to live his life, chemotherapy, surgery, and all of that. So he just decided he'd see what he had left. And he was good for like a year and a half. And then suddenly he just went down, and he ended up in the hospital. And it was really a hard time for all of us. But he eventually became delirious. Of course, they were giving him lots of painkillers, lots of morphine. And when it would get really bad, he would say, Baba, 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 help me. Baba, 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 help me. So I can tell you, Baba was the last thing on my father's mind before he passed. But one day, John and I, my younger brother, came to see him, and they wouldn't let us in the room. You know, they'll say, everyone has to leave, we're going to do whatever, so you have to stand outside. So John and I are standing out there, and we're just talking, and the chart box was there. They didn't have that back then. And John pulls out the chart and starts looking at it, and he's, look, George, look, this is amazing. He started laughing, and I'm like, and they had all his vitals there, and then in the comments it says, patient not taking any nourishment. Patient keeps saying, Bubba, Bubba, please help me. Bubba, please help me. So I thought, yeah, it probably sounded like Bubba to that nurse. But it was remarkable because when Dad passed away, I think here was this guy that seemed so ordinary, and so he was so quiet, not an earth shaker, earth mover, not what traditionally in America you would call a successful person. The funeral home was packed with people. They had to open all the spaces, and it was packed of people from all walks of life. Because my father and my mother, they were very good people. They were people of their word. If they said, in fact, my mother's nickname was I Mean Irene. If she said something, you could take it to heart. She meant it, whether it's good or bad. She was good for her word. And my father touched so many people. I ran into someone he taught while he was taught, and went to high school when Dad was there teaching band. He said, yeah, I knew your father. He said, you know your father? He said, your father was a good man. I said, thank you, Carrie, I appreciate that. I said, but he was too good. He was really too good, and I couldn't grasp it. And then I thought, yeah, he was too good. He was completely open and loving and trusting to everyone. Everyone. So, growing up around here and wanting to fit in with your peers, and growing up around this very, very much Southern culture in this area, I felt like a fish out of water. I like jazz music, and there was no one in Myrtle Beach like that. My father, as far as I knew. And so I felt out of place. So who I really was, I had to kind of stuff under the rug in order to have friends, in order to fit. I wanted to fit in with them when I was growing up, especially after you become a teenager and so forth. But so anything about Baba, I was like, yeah. And I kept wanting to get away from Baba. I didn't want people to say, oh, you're Frank Eaton's son, and you met Baba and all that. I'm like, yeah, please go away. I don't want to talk about that. And went on for a long time. But I think back, everything about it was Baba. I ended up marrying Bevan Robinson. Well, she was Bevan Ramonchuk at the time. But steadfast Baba woman. Had Baba pictures all over her house, you know. Center. That was her life. But here I married her, and I had two beautiful sons, Charlie and Tommy. But still, I grumbled and tried to distance myself from that. I can remember joking with people, the only guy in North Myrtle Beach has got pictures of Jerry Colonna on his Christmas tree. So, but now I feel very bad about that. But it was all part of the progression. So Bevan and I broke up, and I then became involved with another bobbing girl, Beth Rieger. Many of you may remember her. So we ended up cohabitating together, and on Baba's birthday in 1997, I came home from work, and Beth was cooking, and she had music playing. Oh, it's Baba's birthday, and I'm like, yeah. So, and she had this really beautiful photograph of Baba in a deep, old-fashioned wooden frame like you'd see at your grandmother's house. And one of the first things I did when we got together was put a little art lamp over it, and it was in the bedroom. So I went in there to change clothes, and I changed clothes, and as I was walking out, I just stopped and turned and looked at that picture, and I just fell apart. I just fell on my knees, and I cried and cried and cried. And Beth couldn't hear me, the music was blasting, and must have 20 minutes I did that. I just was struck clear through with this feeling of love, and it just floored me. So I went in there and I said, "You won't believe what happened." And I told her why, and she was like, "Oh, that Baba. He spoils you all the time, and on his birthday too." So that was a little step closer. And when that relationship broke up a couple of years later, I befriended this very, very kind lady named Pam Lane. Many of you may know her. And was a Baba setup. I was really feeling bad about breaking up with Beth. So, and she was really feeling bad about a breakup. So we kind of commiserated, and we grew really close. And I would say she realized that she wanted to bring me closer to Baba. So she would have me read Baba books to her. She would then, in the depths of my misery, I became a poet for a few months and would write poetry, and she encouraged me to do that. And she would look at the picture of Baba kissing me and just tell me how special that was and how nice that was. But so I ended up basically serving her. I learned how to serve a woman without living with her and not having a really physical relationship with her. But I loved her. I loved her deeply. I was always there for her. I would cut her grass. I would bring her groceries. She didn't have much money. I would take her son to school in the morning if needed. She needed to go to Columbia once, and she was disabled, and I put a mattress in my car and drove her up there and helped her get in the federal building and declare bankruptcy and brought her back home. So I learned what love was. That's love. It's not what you think it is. So that ended, and I dated a few other Baba girls, always. And so I spent a lot of time alone. And Pam used to say, "You'll never know, he might come visit you tonight." And I'd go to sleep, and I'm like, yeah. So she says, "Take his picture to bed with you." So I did that. Nothing happened. Nothing. So after a long time of that, I wasn't even taking his picture to bed anymore. One night, I had a dream that I was sitting in front of the lagoon cabin, and for some reason I felt so very weary. And there used to be these old chairs that you see in the 50s and 60s where people would bend cedar branches and nail them together and make those kind of old rustic looking. And I remember plopping down those chairs like this, like I was exhausted. And I heard this voice of a lady friend of mine saying, George, George, George. It's far off. And I looked up, there was this light, this bright light, and she was pointing over that way. And I looked into the bright light, and it was like there was a lot of people out there. And the whole time I was hearing, like that. And then suddenly I was like transported out of those people, and I was standing right in front of Baba. And I cannot describe to you how beautiful he was. He was standing there with Robin's egg blue coat and his white pants. And his hair was just beautiful chestnut brown. And his skin was flawless. It looked like caramel, light caramel. And his eyes were just deep, like you could look into them. Unbelievable, unbelievable. And I just looked at him like that. He was kind of looking down like this. And then he looked up, and he came over and embraced me. And I woke up. And I was jumped out of the bed. I was going, oh my God, and tears were pouring down my face. And I paced the floor, and that's all I could think of. My God, I could see that. My God, he came. He came. He really came. He really came. It was an indescribable feeling in my heart. Indescribable feeling. It was like the everything and the nothing. It was just powerful, powerful love. Powerful, powerful love. I told Arlene Stern once about that. And she says, well, he wanted you to have that because he knew you were going to need it. He knew that. And I did. I had heart trouble, many difficulties, but I had that, and I still have that. And I can see that, and I will always see him. And I know he's God. I know that. I know that. Such a blessing. Such a blessing. So it was a long road. I'm sure many of you have stories you can tell. The more I talk to all of y'all, people off and on in here, I'm like, we have so many. They're all coming to the same thing, to be with him. But he has different uses and different things for us to do, different things we have to do to move closer. He does it as gentle as possible. He's so benevolent. He knows we have to feel the pain. He knows we have to go through those things. So we'll love him more and more. We long for him more. We want, and eventually, when we go to him for everything that makes him so very happy, because that's where he gets his happiness, from us. If we're unhappy, he's unhappy. We're happy in thinking about him, praising him, doing things in his name. He's joyous. He's joyous. We are so fortunate to be here. It's not a mistake that each and every one of us are here. I heard a very interesting thing the other day. Baba after he dropped his body, and there was much controversy about him breaking his silence. I remember my father going through that, and it was kind of, you could tell like he was lost after Bob had dropped his body. He felt like he never broke his silence. But he did. He's speaking to us in your heart. That's where he's speaking. He is speaking. After he dropped his body, hundreds of people came. People would show up at that gate. I don't know why I'm here. I just want to be here. I'm here. He broke his silence. He lives in the love in our hearts. I really enjoyed telling you these stories. I can tell you nothing more important. He will take care of you. Trust him. Trust him. Ask him for help. Trust him. He's always there for you.